Dear colleagues, we're on day 243 of Ukraine's heroic resistance. My name is Natalia Staroprava. We're starting our series of briefings at Mediacentrу Ukraine. Russia Will Pay is a project that is currently operating in Ukraine, which it collects data on the damage perpetrated to the Ukrainian state and citizens. It's a common joint initiative of the Office of the President, the Kyiv School of Economics, and the Ministry for Economics. With us is Maksym Nefyodov, a leader of the Kyiv Reform Project at the Kyiv School of Economics. Hello, sir. Hello. Russia has hit critical energy infrastructure, residential buildings. How has the data, what are the numbers, how have the numbers changed compared to September? We don't publicize the information about the most recent strikes on energy infrastructure for security reasons. Obviously, we collect these numbers, but everything we do, the main priority is, of course, not to do no harm and not to open some sort of classified information that might help the enemy. If we, as far as publicly available numbers as of late September, then the overall amount of direct losses, we're talking about brick, concrete, equipment, not any kind of calculations in terms of economic losses through bad logistics. So the direct losses have reached the sum of $127 billion. Number one of this is, of course, residential properties. Unfortunately, Russians have destroyed or damaged about 7.5% of the entire residential fund in Ukraine, primarily, of course, in the eastern regions, where the shellings are the strongest. But of course, we get hits, artillery hits everywhere, and missile hits everywhere. This is essentially 40% of everything that has been destroyed by the Russians on our land. It's almost $51 billion. If you can describe regionally what oblasts of Ukraine, what regions of Ukraine have been most harmed by Russia in the past few months, again, I would like to. I wouldn't like to get into this great important operational data, because we are collecting primarily evidence for courts and analytical information for the government, and of course assistance with repairs and renewal. We were working with partners and local administrations and the government in order to plan the reconstruction. And in the earliest days of after victory, the excavators and bulldozers might start on specific projects rather than start on some difficult processes of planning or appropriating money. So as far as regionally, we should probably talk about the amassed damage since the start of this second stage, the active stage of the war on February 24th. And of course, here it is no surprise that it was those regions that are occupied by Russia that have suffered the worst harm and that have been most affected by hostilities. Of course, we're talking about the Donetsk Oblast, where we know the city of Mariupol, along with the legendary Azovstal plant, has been practically obliterated from the face of the earth. We're also talking about the Kharkiv region. We're talking about Saltivka, where there's hardly a building left standing. We're talking about Izum and other cities in the Kharkiv region that have been recently liberated by the Ukrainian military, and etc. Of course, very important here is also the presence of industrial institutions and establishments, because big objects, both infrastructurally and transport infrastructure, port infrastructure, airport infrastructure, and also the large business institutions can of course skew these regional numbers. Thus, we might mention the oil refinery in Kremenchuk that was destroyed by the Russians. Of course, purely mathematically, one such plant might cost on its own might be worth the price of half a small town. So of course there is some skewing here, but of course the statistics is inexorable. Wherever there was more hostilities, there is more damage, unfortunately. If we're not talking about critical, as far as non-critical and energy infrastructure, you've already started, but can you tell us a bit more about those branches of economy and social life that have taken the most harm from the Russian attacks? Well, as I've mentioned, about 40% of losses has been residential buildings, individual houses, and multi-story. In second place, about 35 billion hryvnia is infrastructure. Obviously, both the bridges and damaged roads that were not built with heavy military machinery in mind. And of course, this asphalt will be simply take the damage to, like we know with the story with the overloaded trucks. In third place is industry, about $10 billion of direct damage. In fourth place is agriculture. It's about $6.6 billion of losses. We have large losses there in infrastructure, for instance, various elevators, and the agricultural technology that the Russians not only destroyed but also sometimes looted, stole, and took out to Russia. A fairly traditional Russian tactic. Perhaps you remember the tragicomic instance when a tractor from the Kherson region with its GPS was traced, thanks to the GPS, to Chechnya, etc. So next in terms of size is education. We are looking at almost $7 billion. Then we have energy structure, energy service, energy sphere, private infrastructures, private cars that were unfortunately also destroyed, etc. Separately, we have to separately speak about the losses for demining. So far, it's very difficult to assess the territory that will need to be demined in various ways, but in any case, we're also talking about at least several billion dollars, possibly even more. Apart from the documentation, we should also talk about compensation for the reconstruction of the infrastructure damaged or destroyed. What can you say? Is this process of reconstruction? Has this process of reconstruction been started? I think that we should, more realistically, we should talk about preparing for reconstruction, because obviously no reconstruction is possible during active hostilities. We're not going to be rebuilding areas of towns or big factories, but of course the government is at work on repairing critical infrastructure, and we should mention the heroic labors of our utilities workers and energy workers, electricians, and they're all doing this in real time, and of course they're also bearing losses in terms of killed or hurt, wounded. We're also working with the Ministry for Infrastructure to direct the reconstruction process as soon as a victory is achieved. Because it's very important that this number, 127 billion direct losses, isn't just a number from a presentation, from some financial document. That is absolutely no use to the citizens or the businesses. It has to turn into specific projects. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of projects of reconstruction, starting from social infrastructure such as kindergartens, hospitals, schools, roads, bridges, heating stations, power plants, and as well as also residential and industrial objects. Of course, that this extent of construction of so many different kinds has been unprecedented in Ukraine. Also, this reconstruction will also be taking place in communities that have taken the most damage since the start of the war. Of course, some of them weren't exactly the most thriving communities even before that, and now planning this process for them will be quite difficult, which is why, together with the Ministry for Regions, we're working on a detailed mapping of all of the objects that have been damaged and that have survived. From satellite data, we're working within an initiative called Rise Ukraine, with the Ministry for Infrastructure, and we try to develop a digital management system for these projects, where you can look at every of these hundreds of projects, what stage, if there are any holdups, are there any systemic problems that need resolution, and we hope that this too will help resolve the question of trust from our donors, from our international partners, and of course the Ukrainian citizens to this process of reconstruction. Once they can see, in the before and after pictures, so to speak, in the ministry, that this object was really destroyed. This wasn't just money that was appropriated, or or perhaps they might see that someone was not included in the registry, or perhaps there was corruption involved. All of this will be out in the open. And on the other hand, in the system, the citizens will be able to observe the progress of reconstruction, the tenders, the contractors, the photographs of the works. Have the payments been made? Is the work proceeding? Is everything fine with permits? Or do we have some illegal construction that will not then be able to be used? All of these digital tools will be very helpful in this process, because you can't, if we had one or two projects of reconstruction, this might be done through some heroic effort individually, by phone. But if we're talking about thousands of projects, we can't have, papers or these big Soviet phones with, rotary phones. None of that will be enough. None of that will suffice. If we want the process of reconstruction not to take decades, then we need to plan it now, which is what we are doing with our partners. This is quite interesting. Could you tell us what donors, what partners have you been cooperating, who have already responded to your calls for reconstruction, for investing into Ukraine's reconstruction after the war? I think that specific numbers that our international partners will be prepared to allocate after victory. Those questions are best addressed to the finance ministry, because the highest priority right now is, of course, military assistance and support of the budget for the current expenditures during the war, because we do have a war to win, rather than just amass money into some sort of fund that will be used after victory. But of course, our hope is that the greatest donor will be Russians themselves. We would love our project that we informally call Russia Will Pay will conclude in the fact that all of those frozen Russian assets of the central bank, of Russian oligarchs, the assets of their state-owned companies abroad will be frozen, confiscated, sold, and given to Ukraine. And hopefully that these sums will be primarily used to reconstruct everything that has been destroyed by Russia, to pay compensations, to help people who have taken physical harm or whose rights were violated. We know these horrible stories about the deportations of Ukrainian children to Siberia, etc., etc. So, of course, we are very hopeful that this will become tool number one. Even me personally, I wouldn't want, Western taxpayers to be the primary bearers of the payments for Russian crimes. But of course, of course, Western partners will also join. And we've heard the numbers that the American government have voiced, where they're looking at possibly $1.5 billion support for Ukrainian budget. We're hoping for at least comparable sums from the EU. And of course, with large infrastructure projects, there will also be the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, the international institutions will be involved, which have already worked in Ukraine on large-scale transport or energy objects. Apart from the donors, the partners, and the Russian funds, the Russian assets, you mentioned Ukrainian citizens. How can each of us, each Ukrainian, play their part in the reconstruction of Ukraine? Well, I think that, again, Ukrainian citizens have to first of all join including with their donations to helping the army. Obviously, this is top priority right now. As far, if we say that every Ukrainian or every Ukrainian businessman or businesswoman, what they can do from the comfort of their couch to collect all the information and help the planning, then well, of course, you can follow the Damage in UA website, and you can give evidence about Russian crimes, about the damage. All of this will be added to our database, and ultimately all of this will be used sooner or later in international courts and in the planning process for the reconstruction. I would particularly like to address to the representatives of the business, including small business owners, asking them to please remember this and please document your losses. We're now talking about a very simple and non-bureaucratic process. There's not a lot of red tape through the Telegram bot, through our website, through Dia, or through Digital Kyiv, or however else. There are many possible ways, because this information must not be forgotten, and ultimately this information has to be integrated with the mapping data that we are collecting from satellites and drones. The more reliable this database is, the higher the trust for this database in international courts or with our Western partners, the sooner the reconstruction will start, and the higher the probability that someone might get compensation. I don't want to make massive promises here. Obviously, this isn't a story about that, today you filled in a form online and tomorrow you get money. No, but this is the kind of work that needs to be done. And in the pre-digital age, this took decades, right? Like the compensation from Iraq to Kuwait and the Kuwait citizens in the Persian Gulf War took 29 years. But using the tools at our disposal that I've already mentioned, I would really like to hope that we might do this much sooner. The documenting the Russian crimes in Ukraine is, of course, necessary for international tribunals, for initiatives that have already started as a fact base. You, as an organization that documents, do you cooperate with international tribunals? Have you managed to transmit any data to them? Well, first of all, obviously we're working with economic crimes. We're looking at damage. We're looking at losses. Because I'm an economist myself, and for the Kyiv School of Economics, this makes sense. This is our area of expertise, where we have a reputation and where our findings can be used the world over and can be trusted in the world. And we have to separate three types of crime that Russia have perpetrated in Ukraine. The first one is, of course, war crimes. This is specifically, Hague or the International Criminal Court. Of which there's been a lot of discourse on social media. Now, these are the worst crimes, but at the same time, they're the hardest to prove and to prosecute. And of course, proving these crimes will take, much like the Balkans or much like Myanmar, this might take possibly decades, because you have to prove not only, for instance, that Russians destroyed a hospital, but that the people who pushed the buttons, so to speak, who gave the order, so to speak, that they were acting with knowledge and with intent and full intent, that this wasn't some kind of mistake, malpractice, that the missile didn't accidentally malfunction or hit a flock of birds or something, which is why the International Criminal Court is involved is looking at a relatively limited circle of persons and a relatively limited circle of events. We're talking about possibly dozens of cases, but probably not more. And again, we're talking about individual criminal liability. We're talking about trying Russian military personnel or Russian politicians that were involved in these things. This next story, which is more mass but also individual, is the violations of human rights. These will be individual suits from businesses or citizens that our Office of Attorney General is working on, and these will follow the chain up to the European Court of Human Rights. This is different things, from wounding and the death of your families to forced deportation or confiscation of property, right? All of the stolen washing machines is what we're talking about. This is where we're talking about probably tens of thousands of suits. But again, they will be addressed either to specific Russians who were involved, or perhaps the Russian state, who might theoretically pay some sort of compensation, as is accustomed in cases that reach the European Court for Human Rights. And of course, there will be economic courts and trials. Those are the ones that we are focused on. Our coalition of NGOs is focused on, and that's where we're looking at not so much human rights violations or wounds or killings. We're looking at economic crime, precisely because it's a specific class of crime. There are particular evidence processes that are somewhat easier than individual criminal liability, and that's where our goal is, not to punish, the criminals who will go to jail. The point for us is to seize and use the assets from Russia that may be used either to compensate for those who have been damaged or to reconstruct Ukraine. We really are working then with several in international legal companies. This is an unprecedented process, much like anything that is happening in this cruel war started by Putin's Russia. But again, the sooner we start and the harder we work, the sooner we'll get a result. I do not doubt that we'll get a positive result, but we would like to walk through all this international red tape as quickly as possible and not get bogged down in courts, where sometimes our Western partners say, well, it'll take, sure, 2 years here and 2 years there and 2 years in another place. Of course, we want to do that. Thank you very much. With us was Maksym Nefyodov, Reform Support Project of the Kyiv School of Economics. Thank you for this conversation, sir. Thank you. We will see you at 3, so please stay with us.